Welcome back to my channel, guys. This is an unusual video for me to make. I actually hesitated to make it for a few different reasons. First off, it's still an ongoing case and it keeps evolving. There's very bizarre twists and turns to it. So what I talk about in this video will probably be outdated very soon. At the time that I'm making this video, it's only been a handful of days since Jonathan Joss was murdered. He was shot fatally. The other thing, though, with this story is that it's kind of controversial. There's two very different perspectives on it and two basically conflicting accounts. So I want to present all of the details, and you can, decide for yourself what you think of this story and what you make of it. But let's dive right into it. Jonathan Joss, as I mentioned, was murdered on June 1st, 2025. He was shot fatally by a former neighbor. Apparently, Jonathan Joss and his husband were visiting their former residence to check on mail that they might have, and an argument ensued with a former neighbor, and Jonathan was shot and died basically on the spot. Now, I was not familiar with Jonathan Joss before this story. Let me know in the comments if you guys were familiar with him, but he was on the show Parks and Recs, which some of you might be familiar with, and he also voiced a character on the animated series King of the Hill. So of course, anytime a public figure not only dies but is murdered, it becomes, tabloid fodder. It becomes a news story, a big news story. But the other key element here that has really made this a buzzing story that keeps circulating and keeps getting more and more traction is that shortly after Jonathan's death, his husband Tristan Kern de Gonzalez took to social media to explain that this was without a doubt a hate crime and that it was the result of deeply rooted homophobia. So of course, when that is told by somebody's husband shortly after his death, it's devastating. And the post on Facebook that I read, that I'm showing here in the video, is really well written, very poignant, very moving. Basically, his husband states that they were actually threatened as a couple because they were a gay couple. They were threatened for years by their neighbors, and their house burnt down under very bizarre circumstances that he believes was due to these threats from neighbors who were homophobic. And all of this tension eventually culminated in Jonathan's death, of being shot by this former neighbor that was one of these homophobic people in their community. His husband, Tristan, claims that the former neighbor who killed Jonathan was yelling violent homophobic slurs before he shot him, and that essentially Jonathan was murdered by someone who couldn't stand the sight of two men loving each other. But then the story takes a bizarre twist because the San Antonio Police Department issued a statement shortly after saying that this is not correct, that despite online claims of this being a hate crime, they haven't found any evidence to suggest that that is the case. But then, to make things even more peculiar, just days after that statement from the police department, they issued another statement saying that it was way, way, way premature of them to believe that this was not a hate crime and that they shouldn't have gone there. They shouldn't have mentioned it. They didn't even have enough information to claim that it was definitely not a hate crime. And since the police department recanted their statement, there's actually been this avalanche of articles providing more context and more color to Jonathan Joss and his dynamic with these former neighbors. Apparently, his former neighbors claim that he was aggressive, hostile, that he would threaten them all the time. Apparently, the police was called on him by neighbors dozens of times over the years. There was an incident with a crossbow where he threatened a neighbor, another with a pitchfork, and apparently he was a huge disturbance in the neighborhood and people didn't feel safe around him. So suddenly there's a different image being painted of him by these former neighbors in the community saying, hey, he was not this gay martyr, protecting his husband from getting shot. This was not the result of homophobia. This was the result of somebody threatening his neighbors for a very long time. And finally somebody pushed back through violence. The circumstances around this gay couple's house burning down are also unusual and ambiguous. Shortly after their house burned down, Jonathan Joss said publicly that he might have somehow left the stove on or, accidentally did something that caused a fire. But then a few months later, and just a few days before he was killed, he showed up to this King of the Hill panel, this event, and apparently he was not invited as a cast member, but he showed up anyway. And he allegedly went on this rant where he talked about his house burning down due to being gay. And it would seem that his husband, Tristan, based on that Facebook post I referenced, that he also has concluded that the house burned down due to arson, that it was intentionally burned down by probably neighbors who, again, were homophobic and did not want them in the neighborhood. Regarding not being invited to this King of the Hill panel, it would seem that Jonathan Joss didn't have the best relationship with his cast members on the show. So the more this information comes out, right, it really makes Jonathan not seem as innocent. And it would seem that there's a theme here, an elephant in the room, which is about mental health, right? Mental health and addiction, and that this narrative that him and his husband have painted might not actually be the reality. Now, of course, regardless of that, that doesn't mean that a murder was justified. I mean, no matter what, it's illegal to kill somebody. But the neighbors of that community now are speaking up and expressing that it's not so black and white, and self-defense was necessary against this neighbor that consistently was creating disturbances, meaning Jonathan Joss. The story is still developing, as I mentioned, but there's right now two camps, of opinion in the public court of opinion. There's one camp that is convinced this is classic homophobia and that the gay couple is being gaslit into being portrayed a very different way from reality. And there's this other camp that's saying, hey, hold on, this is classic addiction and mental health issues in our society, that Jonathan Joss and his husband are really not that innocent here. Of course, it's possible too that all of these themes are relevant, right? That homophobia is baked into it and was ultimately the catalyst for this wrath from the neighbor that shot him fatally. But I think it's also really important to discuss the effect of mental health and addiction in these stories, right? And then when you also throw into it that in America, it's a legal right. It's the Second Amendment of the US Constitution to own guns. So it very much is a pro-gun culture, especially in Texas. You throw that all together with mental health issues and addiction, and it's this story could have never ended well, with or without homophobia. So, as I mentioned, the story is still evolving. We'll see what happens. I'm curious what you guys think about it, if you've been keeping up with it. Is there any other information I have not mentioned that you think is pertinent to the conversation? It's always so contentious when we bring into these conversations, factors like race, sexual orientation, and gender. People tend to jump on the bandwagon of this is classic bigotry. And although that is still possible here, again, the police department realized that could be a possibility for them to recant their statement. I also think it's important to not, jump to that conclusion. I feel like it's always the easy sort of intellectually lazy thing to do, to jump on that rage bait and not critically assess all these other details here that completely complicate the story and really make Jonathan Joss not look like such a victim in all of this, despite ultimately being murdered. Obviously it's tragic no matter what, but the fact that neighbors countless times called the cops on him, that's incredibly concerning. Let me know in the comments what you think, and let's see how this story keeps evolving.